Recording says the provost.
I'm probably on the back end. Right.
Thank you for all coming. I have a real short introduction. You probably already know who Connor is. We've been chatting with him for an hour. So Connor began teaching for us in fall 2018 and off and on for about 3 years. He taught for us with great success. He was a Yale PhD student at the time. But then he had to leave us because he was presented with an opportunity for the naming commission as the lead historian. So his doctoral work in history and African American studies is nearing completion, and his work for the naming commission will be completion in 2024. So let's welcome him again. You already did, but let's welcome him again back to Southern.
We can hear me online. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. A number of thank yous at the start. Thank you very much for the pizza. As a person who moved away from New Haven, I have missed it. I'm a 19th century historian, but I prefer modern pizza. Thank you also to Professor Paddock and Professor Petto. You hired me for my first ever teaching job as a historian, a real historian, and I can trace everything in my career back to a cup of coffee I got with Professor Paddock in Hamden, and the first day I met with Professor Petto when she was department chair here. And also just a big thank you to the Southern Connecticut State University community. When you're a historian going throughout, say, the American South, doing unpopular work of, say, taking Confederate names off bases, it really helps to be able to talk about history, not just what I have my doctorate in, which is 19th century US history, Civil War history, but to really be able to talk about a breadth of American history, to discuss everything from Columbus to the present. And I was exceptionally well primed to do that because of the students I had at Southern. I knew every class I taught here, they would have questions that would take me all over American history. So I had to go all over American history as a result, and it gave me a tremendous wealth of knowledge. So in so many ways, it's so wonderful to be back and just grateful to be here today. I also want to just briefly outline what I'm going to do in this talk. Can you hear me in the back okay? Yeah. All right, and I trust online, but give me a level up if you can. I'm going to explain what the naming commission was, what we did, kind of ground this into historical theory. I'm going to talk about a few of the name changes we actually made, why we made those, how we made those. And then I'm going to close with some broader thoughts about kind of history, what's changing, what's staying the same, in some cases what's reverting. So one of the frequent charges, and we didn't have that many critics, which we'll talk about also, but that the critics of the naming commission was that we were erasing history, that this was Orwellian. The title of this talk, Making Treason Odious Again, actually comes from a quote by a famous, infamous American of the 19th century who said during the end of the Civil War that treason must be made odious once more. And are there any guesses as to who that American was? Some people say Sherman, hardliner, Total War. Yep. Ulysses Grant, another great option. Some people say Abraham Lincoln or Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, these hardcore radical Republican congressmen. It was actually none of those people. It was then Senator and soon to be Vice President-elect Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. And Andrew Johnson is probably, this is a sadly pretty fierce competition, but probably the most racist, white supremacist, poorest president we've had, or certainly up there with them. But the point of that is that even Andrew Johnson, who by no means was a fan of emancipation or civil rights, realized what the Confederates had done was treason. So as we change these commemorations, take their names off military bases, we're not so much erasing history as we are rediscovering history as it existed at the close of the Civil War before 150 years of sentimentality took over. The results of this are pretty clear today. There are statues coming down all across the United States, largely in the, quote, American South, end quote, where most of the statues were to begin with. But even Fort Hamilton in New York City had a Robert E. Lee Avenue, which is no longer Robert E. Lee Avenue. It's named after an African-American serviceman from the Vietnam War now. But these statues, people have pointed out, I don't think they had to use Union Blue to take Lee off the pedestal there. But after his statue in Richmond was radically reinterpreted by protesters with different graffiti, people point out Stonewall Jackson on Monument Avenue in Richmond. This is the kind of the heart of the Confederate monument area. Without the equestrian Jackson on top of there, it looks more like a tomb or a crypt than it does an honorific statue. And then the headquarters of the United Dollars, the Confederacy, which was built in the 1920s, those huge golden colored brass doors are meant to be this beacon of power. Now they're barricaded shut to keep out the unwanted attention. But as we think about statues coming down, this is actually a very old problem. It's one of the oldest problems we ever have. One of the best poems ever written about history was written by a man named Percy Bysshe Shelley, who today is actually most famous probably for being the husband of Mary Shelley. So yay to gender politics, and I mean that. But he wrote poems too. He died a lot earlier than she did. But he wrote this poem called Ozymandias. It describes a statue in the desert. He's writing 1817, right after Napoleon's empire has failed. He says, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, hath sunk a shattered visage, a face, lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read. So we've got a desert scene, we've got this mean looking face, half buried in the desert. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So it's this poem about a shattered statue in the desert. Ozymandias, you may know not just from the Watchmen comic book and movie, but Ozymandias is the Greek name for Ramses, the great pharaoh of Egypt. But that line on the pedestal, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, is one of the great double entendres of poetic history. Because when Ramses had it put up there, it was saying, look how great I am. You'll never have a greater empire than I do. Of course, now, the mighty of today should look at it in despair, realizing that Ramses' empire fell, change has happened, and they should despair because their own ideas, they one day change. That's also Ramses in the British Museum. And then the upper left-hand corner is actually, this literally happens still today. They were digging a sewer ditch in Cairo, and they came across a statue of, you know who, Ozymandias, buried in the mud and sand of Cairo. So these changing statues are still coming up. And this is a cross-religion region. Marcus Tullius Cicero, before he himself was killed in the Civil War, the great Roman statesman wrote, for the life of the dead consists in the memories of them cherished by the living. Say that one more time. For the life of the dead consists in the memories cherished of them by the living. One of the reasons that we have monument statues is because for, quote, great people, end quote, it's a way to remember, to have immortal life that has nothing to do with a spiritual tradition of souls persisting. This may sound familiar. Some people say, you know, you die twice, once when you pass and once when nobody remembers your name. It's also the motif to the Walt Disney movie Coco, which my kids love. But the point of all that is to not have too much fun, to point out when you have Marcus Tullius Cicero and Walter Disney on the same page, you've got a real human phenomenon. So these are really deep issues. Now, I got involved in this work in the summer of 2020, which, to remind us, witnessed probably the greatest in terms of sheer numbers protests in American history. It's difficult to pin down exactly how many people turned out in early June to protest the death and now convicted murder of George Floyd at police hands. But something very strange happened in that summer with COVID, with the election. I think 2020, there's 1968, 1918, there are these years that kind of reverberate down. I think 2020 is gonna be one of those years. But Congress was just then writing the National Defense Authorization Act for the next year. It's called the NDAA for short. This is the single most expensive, biggest bill our government does on a yearly basis. It funds the entire military for the entire year. It was famous 2 years ago because the military asked Congress for $800 billion. Congress looked at it and said, you know, China, Ukraine, there's a lot of scary stuff going on in the world. Here's $50 billion extra dollars, or $40 billion. So they gave them $40 billion extra dollars, which any organization would love to have that kind of surplus. But into that act, they wrote a provision. It was 1 page long. It was section 370, which means, I know we're not a math lecture, but there were how many sections before it? This bill is big. And section 370 established a commission to develop a plan to rename, remove, or modify any Department of Defense item, name, symbol, monument, display, asset, or paraphernalia. Even a cocktail napkin or a golf ball from the Fort Hood tournament in 2019 that commemorated the Confederate States of America or anybody who voluntarily served in the Confederacy. So one thing I always point out is our task was not to say, should this come down or not? It was, does this commemorate a Confederate? No matter how you feel about Robert E. Lee, he voluntarily served the Confederate States of America. And so our job was to, in some ways, not make that decision, but rather to help the American people through this change. It's also important, they put us into the NDAA, which has broad bipartisan support. Nobody wants to be against the Army for many good reasons. And they put it in right at the bottom here. So right as it went back to the vote houses for an up or down vote. This act had, besides the naming commission, there's other 369 sections and more than that. It had better parental leave for our Army soldiers and civilians. It had better increases in how they can get their vacation time. It had more pay for civilians serving in combat zones. It had anti-discrimination funding in it. This bill had a lot of really important things in it that had broad bipartisan support. And because of that, it was guaranteed to pass, essentially. Now, President Trump was president at the time. He vetoed the act, and he tweeted his veto, as he often did. I won't read all of this, but his rationale at the end was that these monumental and very powerful bases, he's talking about places like Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, Fort Hood, have become part of a great American heritage and a history of winning, victory, and freedom. Our history as the greatest nation in the world will not be tampered with. Respect our military. And I would call out two things, apolitical. Our history as the greatest nation of the world, that's tricky. You can look at Ming China in 1450 or the Roman Empire in 181. Plenty of other pretty great nations, empires out there. But the memory of our greatest nation in the world, that really matters. The other part, I think, this idea of part of a great American heritage and history of winning, victory, and freedom, that's also this idea of memory we should think about. Because if you're a Confederate soldier, the one thing you did, without question, is you fought and you killed United States Army soldiers. And that phrasing is really important. If you served in what we too often call the Union Army or the Blue or the Yankees or the Federals, you look down your belt buckle, it didn't say Federal, Union, Blue. Yeah, it said United States of America on it. You were in the same army that George Washington started, that Colin Powell served in, all the way down to our present military people in ROTC and other programs today. That is the expanse of the American military. If you're in the Confederate Army, you are part of a force that had no antecedent and has no descendants save for perhaps the Ku Klux Klan. And after the veto happened, this is very interesting. President Trump vetoed the defense bill, and history matters, contingency matters. What happens when really matters. So right before Christmas, he vetoes the bill. Over the Christmas break, which is usually a very calm time in Washington, D.C., a lot of organizations, including the Heritage Foundation, who were very conservative organizations, said, why did he veto this? We need a defense law. Our military has to be paid. You're going to hold that all up over some Confederate base names with what's going on in the country right now? And then Congress, which had a Republican-held Senate, voted to override the Trump veto for the first time in his entire presidency. They said, we're going to keep this renaming happen. And that veto override vote, they needed 67 senators. They got 87. And the few that voted against to keep the veto, Bernie Sanders voted that, not because he agreed with President Trump, he had other issues with this bill. So it had a broad bipartisan support. 322 congressmen joined them. But this all happened January 1st. Nobody knew, some defense experts predicted, but nobody knew that 5 days later, on January 6th, a crowd was going to storm the Capitol and remind us why the Confederacy still matters in this country, and the memory of it should still be very closely and carefully guarded. I think it's also funny, in this photograph, the gentleman on the left is John C. Calhoun, who is the architect of Southern secession, and he died before the Civil War started, but if anyone was pro-Confederate, it'd be that man looking down from the portrait. And there's poor Daniel Webster in the middle, who's always caught between sides. So the commission that was set up involved men and women who had collectively, and I mean this in the best way possible, about 3 centuries of experience in civil military relations, in Washington, D.C. government. Our chair was the first woman to ever hold the 4-star rank of admiral and first African-American woman to hold a 4-star rank in any service. Our vice chair was the former history department chair of West Point, Brigadier General Ty Sedgley. We had the head of the Army Corps of Engineers on there. We had the commandant of the Marine Corps. We had John McCain's foreign policy advisor. We had the head of the draft of the Obama administration. We had a sitting congressman, Austin Scott, who actually got news recently. He was one of the people who stepped up to become the next Speaker of the House and got, I think, 85 votes in favor of him. It was a fully packed commission full of people who had, as I said, centuries of experience between them. And what we did, this slide's kind of confusing, but I'll try to explain it, how it all worked out. The words are near the picture that does the thing. What I mean by that is that Congress mandated our work. They were the ones who created us. They're the ones who funded us. We worked for Congress. So we reported our findings to Congress. But at the same time, since we were working with the military, and Congress don't have any better access to military bases than we do in this room, the military supported our mission. We had 6 full-time staff like myself. I was lead historian. We had a lawyer, a public affairs person, a legislative affairs person, an archivist, a planner. But we had, 6 direct support staff. We had about 50 military officers supporting our work, and very high ranking. A major general was detailed to us the entire time just to make sure that the naming commission got the cooperation that we needed. I had colonels who had flown combat missions in Iraq calling me to, see if I was going to be okay to make it through a snowstorm in places, which is a strange, humbling experience. So they support our mission. We heard their thoughts. We listened to the military deeply. At the same time, and this is really important, we're independent of the military. As a thought experiment, Chief of Staff, Chief Joint Chief of Staff Chairman Mark Milley, head of the entire defense apparatus, could have called up my boss or me and said, I want you to do this. And we could have said, thank you, we're going to do the exact opposite. That never happened, but that's the power structure at work here. The last I have up there, just important to remember that Congress funds the military and the military serves the people. We have a civilian-led military in this country, which goes back all the way to 1783 when George Washington ended a would-be coup by his junior officers, resigned his commission, maybe handed over his sword. We're not sure if he gave his sword, and returned the military to civilian control, which is a key part that not every country has. So for 2 years, the commissioners and myself and the rest of the commission toured the country. We went to 10 different bases that had Confederate names, and we had full day-long, multi-day tours of those bases, heard from stakeholders. We briefed Congress several times. That's Vice Chair Ty Sedgley and myself in the House Armed Services Committee briefing room. And we wrote 3 reports to Congress that outlined our recommendations for what amounted to be, and you can't make this up, 1,111 lines of Excel spreadsheet that all referred to Confederate honoring assets that the DoD controlled. We gave our reports in the fall of 2022. The military has had all of 2023 to make the changes. They were all accepted, endorsed. And in fact, just at the end of last month, at what was formerly Fort Gordon in Georgia, that became Fort Eisenhower. And they brought in Ike's granddaughter and the Secretary of the Army in an old-fashioned Jeep. This picture in the upper right, just one of those kind of crazy cool things. President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower's 2 granddaughters are on either side. And then in the middle is the veteran who was Ike's IT guy during World War II. He set up the telephone lines, made sure that as the headquarters moved, he's 99 today. He was actually in the room in Rheims in 1945 when General Eisenhower accepted the formal surrender. And so he was there and returned to civilian life. The commissioners were all, and myself, happy to attend. Always pick the seat on the end, you get better leg room that way. The one thing remaining, we can talk in questions and answers maybe, that is yet to be removed is the Confederate monument at Arlington National Cemetery. We recommended this be removed, not because I have some kind of great hatred of disturbing cemetery monuments, but our charge was, is a Department of Defense asset? Yes, it is. Does it commemorate the Confederacy? Yes, it does. So how do you remove or modify this thing? I will also say that we're not changing any of the headstones here. That I actually did have one nightmare doing this work where there's a famous Civil War picture of an African-American man who has the skulls of soldiers that were unearthed at Cold Harbor, and he's got them in a wheelbarrow. In my nightmare, he came to me with those and said, here, they're yours now. And I cold sweat woke up. So I'm not in favor of any of that ever happening. But this monument, which is not a grave marker, is frankly, as my friend Ty Sedgley says, problematic from top to bottom. Everything about it is inaccurate history. There are 14 state shields, even though only 11 states were in the Confederacy. They just flat out drafted Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland to join their cause. The graves themselves are in a Confederate cross. There's this really problematic picture of this African-American woman who's depicted as a mammy, as a kind of happy enslaved woman who's tearfully holding the son of her enslaver as he goes off to war. And then there's this this motto in Latin, which says Victrix causa des placut, not a Latinist, sed victa catoni, which translates roughly into the victorious cause was pleasing to the gods, but the lost cause was pleasing to Cato. If you know anything about Cato, he's a hardcore Roman Republican. When Caesar's taking over, making the Roman Republic into an empire, Cato stands against him. He sends to death. They're going to kill him by disemboweling him, as happened back then. And Cato, they can't quite finish it, but Cato, the good Republican that he is, finishes the job. He reaches into his stomach and yanks out his entrails. What this translates into more broadly is you, the United States, were always wrong, and we, the Confederates, were always right. Is is essentially what they're trying to say. And have that in the middle of a cemetery started as a resting place for United States soldiers killed preserving a republic is troubling to say the least. So that's what we've done. There are lawsuits that have been filed. They're holding this up. I don't think the lawsuits are going to go anywhere, but we believe in the rule of law, so we're seeing them out step by step. When we do work like this, though, there are questions that kind of rise up and they float around a bit. And you can start anywhere on this chart. Once, isn't this erasing history? I addressed that a little bit, but aren't you changing the past when you change? What happens if I put a monument tomorrow and then 100 years from now somebody takes it down? You're erasing history. What about all the good things? Isn't it true that Robert E. Lee at Appomattox surrendered? He could have led a guerrilla insurrection, but he surrendered. He gave up. He told the Confederate soldiers to go home. He said we have to accept the consequences. Didn't Stonewall Jackson have a Sunday school for his enslaved people? Weren't all Americans racist? And this is actually a real problem because most Americans were. You can find notable exceptions, and we should celebrate those people. But Abraham Lincoln wrote and said things, especially in his early career, that make your skin turn about how he thought about African Americans. And then lastly, how can you judge somebody for the culture they grew up in? And this is really important, I think, as a historian. I have kids. They're going to come of age one day, and they're going to ask me why I rode in SUVs with friends that got 8 miles a gallon across New England to play in a sea-level hockey tournament in 1997. We weren't going to pros. There was no, but what my generation has done to the environment, we didn't know better, at least at the start. So how can you judge us for the culture they grew up in? And the problem, I think, too often, these questions get out there, and I have the hurricane up there because they circle around and around and around in the warm waters of our memories until there's a fever pitch. But if you actually think about these on their merits, there are good answers to all of them. And to do that, there's a great document by one of the great historians of European history, actually, a man named Pierre Nora. And in 1989, Pierre Nora was writing about the French Revolution. It was a bicentennial of the French Revolution. And he's thinking about the Bastille Day. I grew up, like most American of my generation, thinking the Bastille Day was like the 4th of July. It was the French 4th of July, and it happens in July, 10 days after our 4th of July. So it's an easy way to think about it that way. The start of French independence. They stormed this castle. They liberated political prisoners. The problem with that Nora realized is that when they stormed the Bastille in 1789, it was already falling down. It had a total of 10 prisoners in it. 6 forgers, 2 con men, and 2 people who were so, quote, wicked, their families asked for them to be put into the Bastille. What they don't say about the Bastille Day is that they beheaded 2 lower-level French officials, including the head of the Bastille, and they paraded their heads around on pikes in Paris. And so Nora was trying to figure out how this, why the French tied their origin myth to this moment. And he came up with a quick essay, and it's about memory and history. And he said, we have 2 things that are actually very different. There's memory and there's history. And just to read Nora for a few moments. Memory and history, far from being synonymous, appear now to be in fundamental opposition. Memory is life, born by living societies. It remains in permanent evolution, open to the dialectic of remembering and forgetting. Our memories change. Unconscious of its successive deformations, we forget that our memories change. Vulnerable to manipulation and appropriation, oh yeah. Susceptible to being long dormant and periodically revived. How many times do you think about something you haven't thought about in 5 years because you hear a song on the radio? Memory is a evolutionary, I'm not reading for Nora here, it's an evolutionary trait that helps us as humans make sense of being one of 8 billion organisms of our species on this planet. And it's really important too. If I ever have to have detailed surgery, I want the surgeon to have a darn good memory, because because I don't want to be having a textbook open kind of, down. That's not good. So we need memories. We need memories to help us understand the enormity of the Holocaust. The number 6 million is an abstract figure. We need to see those shoes and shaving kits at Auschwitz to have our memories kick in about the tremendous loss. We can have too much memory sometimes. So history, on the other hand, is the reconstruction, always problematic and complete, of what is no longer. History is trying to figure out what actually happened back then, no matter how we feel about it. Memory is a perpetually actual phenomenon. History is representation of the past. And I would argue that our country, for a long time, it's changing, has had way too much Civil War memory and not nearly enough Civil War history. And that's what's been changing. What I mean by that is that we have a pretty unique relationship with our Civil War. We have Civil War reenactors. This is a pretty rare thing. You can't go to Barcelona in Spain and go to a Sunday morning and see fascists and Republicans getting out the machine guns and the gas canisters to reenact the siege of Barcelona. But every year, and for the 150th anniversary, we had a huge party at Gettysburg. Men who are, well, mostly men, far older, far better educated, far wealthier, far more vaccinated, far better fed, get together at Gettysburg and pretend to have the Battle of Gettysburg for 3 days. Now, Civil War reenactors, you may know some, I know some, they're my friends, they're my allies. I'm not trying to make fun of them. But again, if you really want to reenact the Civil War, you've got to lose your shoes, eat about 800 calories a day, lose all your vaccinations, sleep in the wilderness, the elements, march, do that for about 3 weeks, have rudimentary health care, and then you get to the Civil War. So we want a Civil War, all of us, where you can take pictures of it with your digital camera. There are portalets for these men to use instead of open air latrines. You can watch it all from a lawn chair. And always, if somebody has heat stroke, there's a nice ambulance there to get them to safety. And the next slide is very grim. It has amputations, so I apologize for that. But the history of the Civil War is far, far different. The American Civil War remains deadlier than all of our other wars combined. So, Revolution, 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Global War on Terror, Civil War. It was 10 times deadlier per capita for American soldiers than World War II. Confederates killed 10 times as many Americans as the Nazis did. And men who survived were forever injured. These photographs are actually here in New Haven. They're right down the street at the Cushing Library that Yale Medical School has. At the end of the war, photography was good enough, things were modern enough that they had these photographs taken of wounded United States soldiers. And the photographs there, what's terrifying in a way is on the back of them, they have these very modern medical write-ups. The bullet entered the left anterior, severing the ventricle. If not for the camera technology, these guys could be in color with us today. That's how good the photographs are. Commemoration is where memory and history meet. So I had to write ultimately about what the naming commission was doing, and I tried to point out that we're not changing memories. That's a thought police thing that I don't want to have any part of. I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't remember. That seems like a fruitless, impossible task. But history, memory, commemoration are different. So I had to write this up, and what I settled in was this. Although Americans owe much of our modern identity to the Civil War, they do not owe equal commemoration to both sides. Though often conflated, commemoration and history come from all sections of our society and serve different purposes for different people. History describes the people and places of the past in all their greatness and grimness, achievements and failures, nobility and notoriety. History is complicated. Commemoration elevates an act, event, or individual by bestowing it with communal esteem and honor. Commemoration is aspirational. The best histories present humans and their choices in the context of the complex and complicated days they live through. The best commemorations highlight individuals, movements, and moments that epitomize the highest values of our present and motivate us as we shape our societies of the future. Then I had to find a way to get out of this. I had Nora in one hand as I was writing this. History recounts, explains, and examines. Commemoration celebrates, affirms, and extols. History is about who we were. Commemoration is about who we strive to be. History is the past, commemoration is our hopes for the future. And the naming commissioners I was honored to work for and the commission I was honored to work on ultimately decided that it was far better to have those 9 names on the right than it was to have the Confederates on the left. Now, how do we do this? This is an American process. Also, in the military, you probably know, a big Army-Navy rivalry, and the Navy always says that the Army slides have too many words on them, and the Army says that's because the Navy doesn't like to read, and this is an Army slide. But in any case, so what we did to find these names, as much as I like to say that I, as a historian, just read all of American history and sat in my office in Hampton, Connecticut, a few miles away, and pulled these 9 names out of the ether and said, here they are, that would be inaccurate, unfair, and wrong, because this should be an American process. So we listened to Americans from all over. In fact, we had 6 different means of communication. Congress people, congressmen, congresswomen, senators sent us, letters. I want you to think about this name. They're from my district. Matters a lot to us. Government officials did also. Enlisted soldiers who are 19, 20, privates, corporals. They gave us recommendations in person and by letter. And I gotta say, being in a room dressed like this and watching a 20-year-old, apologies, but as I get older, young adult, some would say almost kid, reach into the pocket of his fatigues and pull out a piece of paper that he's been writing on from the base library and say, here's a name. That's a deep moment. We heard from officers and Army civilians. I've enlisted in the Army for a couple of years. Officers, Army civilians, they're there for life. They're lifers. We got direct letters from Americans, things scratched out on pieces of notebook paper with a, not literally lick stamp, but a stamp pressed on the envelope. We had a website, and we had website submissions from people who recommended them. And then local communities. We went to all the communities where these bases were. We knew, again, Fort Lee had to be renamed. Fort Bragg had to be renamed. That wasn't in suspense. So we went to these communities and we heard what they thought. They gave us ultimately 35,000 recommendations, and 3,500 of those were unique names. And we looked at those and said, okay, one really good way, it wasn't like an American Idol, the most votes wins. In fact, the most votes was William Tecumseh Sherman, which, as much of a pro-United States guy I tend to be, was a bit mean to name a fort in Georgia after William Tecumseh Sherman. But we said, if one way of knowing this is a good candidate, if a senator, enlisted soldier, officer, Army civilian, letter writer, website person, and local communities all said they'd be a good idea, that means a lot of Americans find power in the story. And from that, we found 450 candidates who were really meritorious. That's when, as a historian, I really jumped into play. I met with other Army historians in big conference rooms. We had Post-it notes and cards. It was in COVID, so we had masks on. We were all in our different quadrants. We'd approach the table one at a time. Government takes COVID very seriously. And as a result, we came down to a short list of 87 finalists. We re-engaged those groups. The commissioners took a few names off. They put a few names on. We went back to these communities, said we're thinking about these 9 or 10 names. And eventually that's how we got, after in-person deliberation, those 8 commissioners all traveled to DC from around the country. We met for 3 days straight, catered by Panera. And after those deliberations, we ended up with these names, which I can speak about a bit more in the question and answer period. But I'm just going to very briefly kind of try to summarize a little bit. It became a question of better or worse. So no longer is it, is it right or wrong to have a fort named after A.P. Hill? Is it better to have a fort named after A.P. Hill, who commanded Confederate armies to great success, killing many United States soldiers at Antietam and elsewhere, who actually kind of committed suicide by U.S. soldier. He rode out against, as the Confederates were retreating from Richmond, he rode out to try to confront the United States Army and was shot. Better to name it after him or Dr. Mary Walker, the first woman, only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor for being the first surgeon, a woman surgeon ever hired by the Army, who treated soldiers instead of killing them. Fort after Leonidas Polk, who never served a day in the United States Army. As soon as he got out of West Point, he resigned his commission, went to be a plantation owner, who was the worst general on either side of the Civil War. In fact, Wag once wrote that the worst shot the U.S. ever fired was the shot that killed Leonidas Polk, because if they had let him live, he would have done more bad things and they would have won the war faster. Him or Henry Johnson, an African-American private, born Jim Crow, who enlisted in World War I, whose trench was attacked by a German raiding party, who could have surrendered, but instead sounded the alarm. He fired his rifle till it was empty, threw his grenades, they're out. He swung his rifle like a club until it broke, and he fought hand to hand to defend his comrade, his position, and receive the Medal of Honor. Better or worse to have named after Johnson or Polk? Better or worse to name it after George Pickett, who is famous for being Pickett's Charge, that could be called, Longstreet's Assault or Hancock's Defense. It's kind of a fate that his name's attached to this. If you ever read the great Civil War letters of George Pickett that write home to his wife so romantically, it's like, man, I wish I could write that way. It's because she wished he could write that way. They're actually entirely false. She made them up 30 years after the war and published them as his wartime letters. He actually, from all accounts, is a pretty poor general. As best he could, he did once threaten to hang 20 United States soldiers for every one Confederate soldier that was hung, and he did actually execute some prisoners of war, making him more criminal. Better for him or for Van Barfoot, who at 24, as one of 15 million U.S. World War II soldiers, was closing in on Rome, had to navigate a minefield by himself, captured 3 German machine gun nests, took more prisoners than he killed, secured the position. That was before lunch. After lunch, Germans counterattacked. He grabbed a bazooka, destroyed one of 3 tanks, then went forward again alone, disabled a huge artillery piece with a mine, found 2 U.S. soldiers who had become essentially shell-shocked, disoriented, got them back to line of safety, all at the age of 24. Better or worse to name after Pickett or Barfoot as a Native American. I'm going to breeze through the next few slides, and maybe if someone wants to ask a question, the question and answer period, like what were those slides about? I can tell you very briefly. But to point out just that our Civil War memory needs to change a lot away from this idea ultimately of brother against brother, where these 2 men who look the same might in fact be brothers or trying to push each other. And I grew up in the American Gladiators generation, which probably makes me either too young or too old for this audience, depending who you are. But whoever pushes each other hardest is going to win. We need a Civil War history that gets away from this kind of memory and back to the complex history of the war as it actually unfolded. Now, I do want to point out that as I'm saying these things, I'm grateful to be saying them with some degree of style. That's not original to me. In fact, I'm indebted to generations of scholars, from Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells, to W.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Annette Gordon-Reed, and dozens, hundreds of others who clearly have something in common and different from me, but who never forgot during this great North-South white person reconciliation that the Civil War was a struggle became a struggle between liberty and slavery. In fact, Frederick Douglass, on all these themes, said at the end of his life, he didn't know he was going to die the next year. He died very suddenly. He thought he was going to keep living for a long time. But he was trying to think about what's going on in the country with all these reunions of soldiers. And he said, that's memory. That's not history. History of the war needs to be remembered. So he said, but whatever else I may forget, I shall never forget the difference between those who fought for liberty and those who fought for slavery, between those who fought to save the Republic and those who fought to destroy it. That's Lincoln's take, it was Douglas's take, and it's increasingly becoming our take. And as a historian, Robert E. Lee is still going to win the Battle of Chancellorsville. Joe Hooker is still going to get shocked by a shell. It's going to be a horrible United States Army defeat. That's not changing. But as an American and a parent, I'm really glad that my kids are going to grow up in a country that has commemorations that more closely match the ideals we fight for and not the movement against our country. Thank you. I'd love to hear questions. I'm happy to stay for as long as there are questions and to have. I know some people might have to go, but the questions, we also have online questions perhaps. So questions from anybody in the audience?
And let's just remember, we have the room until 2.
Oh, okay.
So we will, right, those of you who teach it, it's 2 o'clock, then the next class begins, right?
Okay.
So we may be driven out 2 minutes before so they can come in, but.
Okay, maybe I'll have talk in the hall. Questions, yes. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talks, which is great. So I was listening to an AHA podcast about commemoration of the Civil War and renaming places in New Orleans.
Yes.
Just recently. And they were just those historians who were involved in that process were just talking about how challenging that work was, particularly in the local context.
Yeah. Right,
within a municipal structure.
Yes.
You were operating under a very different structure. Could you talk about, like, you know, perhaps on some level the sort of sweepingness of what you were able to do from a national or federal perspective versus some of the really challenging stuff that's being worked out in a more local context?
Absolutely, yeah. The question is largely has to do with who owns what, is the shortest way to say it. And that a lot of monuments were given to municipalities by groups in 1912, 1915. And you have to go back to that gift and see what the lawyers did or didn't write into it to see who can do what they're going to do with it. Because ultimately, in a nation of laws, no matter how much you don't like something, if there's a legally binding contract, that is often legally binding. This was limited to the Department of Defense. So the best example I can give is the Confederate monument is going to come down in Arlington. The Robert E. Lee House, which is officially called the Robert E. Lee Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, that's owned by National Park Service, not by the Department of Defense. And therefore, that's going to stay up until they decide to change it. So that's one of those thorny issues of kind of who owns what. But more and more, I think people are finding very creative ways to get around that. I worked with Sewanee, the University of the South, who has Confederate memorials everywhere. And they had a painting that was supposed to hang in perpetuity in a chapel of Kirby Smith, who's one of the Confederate generals. But somebody asked, can we borrow that? They said, sure. In fact, you can borrow it for as long as you want. No need to return it. Your permanent loan. And so it's still technically owned by Sewanee, but I think there's not a return address on that envelope. So there are ways to get around it like that. And there are a lot of lawyers, a lot of court cases going to say, you know, where does the letter of the law meet the spirit of the law, and how can we do that? It's a great question. Yes.
So thank you for the talk. I actually have to go to class in like 2 minutes, so I'll try to make this quick. Why change the names to commemorate other people rather than just be like the fort in, you know, this area?
A lot of people point that out, and we're aware. I mean, some of these new names are of people who themselves had failings. Dwight Eisenhower had a portrait of Robert E. Lee on the Oval Office walls. Mary Walker had some weird theories about how depravity worked. I won't go into right now. So we stopped looking for saints. But at the very first engagement we had, the West Point chaplain, which is kind of an intense job to have, he stood up and he said, "You're going to hear from a lot of people that just name them, Fort Fayetteville or Fort Blackstone, or even some wags Fort A, B, C, D, and E. That's the least controversial way. But he said that if you do that, you lose the chance to tell a story. And in our commemorative landscape, we can say that there is something worthy in Henry Johnson's devotion to duty, or in Michael Novosel, helicopter pilot, who rescued 5,000 people over his career and went into the same hot zone 14 times to get wounded South Vietnamese soldiers, not even Americans, out. In the efforts of Arthur Gregg and Charity Adams to desegregate the Army. And that in our commemorative landscape, we can do that. The problem with Confederates, really, is the thing they're known for is something that I would argue we just simply cannot commemorate as the United States. Whether it's nothing in their movement is really commemorable. That's a word I just created. So that was the logic there, that it's better to have people who are flawed, but to find their values that we want to share and aspire to than otherwise. Yes?
You mentioned the idea of not naming the fort in Georgia after General Sherman out of respect. Applying like that same kind of like logic to the monument in Arlington Cemetery, what do you think you could replace it with that would not glorify the Confederacy and Confederate values while at the same time showing respect for the people buried there?
Yeah, and it's in quite because what's been recommended, what we'll do eventually, there's a huge granite slab this rests on, and we can't jackhammer that up because if we do, the graves will be disturbed. Essentially, human remains will be vibrated into dust, and we don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So there's been talk about what could go up there. I don't fully know because there are far better artists than I am out there. I hope they'll be stark. I hope they'll be clear. One thing people ask, are there any Confederate monuments you kind of approve of? This is one I actually do approve of, which is in Richmond. It's in Hollywood Cemetery. It goes up in 1869. It's a pyramid full of just rough cut granite from the James River. And you can see the tombstones are minuscule, 90 feet tall. They're 4 feet tall. I know the pyramid's a bit dignified, but something that just denotes the scale of loss without any heroism. I always try to say, I'm a millennial. I don't want to time travel back in time and find some Confederate kid who enlisted at 18 because his parents made him to, and then he survived the war. And by the way, the Confederacy, 1862, 1 year into the war, they extend enlistments for life. They say those 3-year terms we talked about, you're in it for life. We're going to win soon, don't worry. But if we don't, you're still in the Army till we do. So he survived somehow through a horrible fight. He's in Petersburg, Virginia. He's starving. He has typhus. I don't want to kick him and say, how dare you? On a human scale, we need to see that suffering the same way people need to see the suffering of enslaved people. But a monument to that looks vastly different than a heroic Robert E. Lee on horseback. So something that shows sheer suffering. Yeah, maybe one more question. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, of course, there's discussions about arguments on both sides of reparations. And if I'm not mistaken, people say the U.S. has never paid reparations. They have. They paid them in 1865, I believe, after the Emancipation Proclamation, to the white slave owners. That every slave was freed, got $300, $1,865 from the United States government.
To some people, I don't mean it. Yeah, I didn't mean it.
But it's a hunk of burning love, current dollars.
That was, well, Lincoln's plan throughout the war to try to, the Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves so they were in territories under rebellion. For enslaved people in loyal, that's a tricky thing. How do you keep Kentucky on your side and tell them you're going to free their enslaved person? So there's all these themes about emancipation, and some people are emancipated, are compensated. As they're emancipated, their enslaved are compensated. To me, I think that's a crime. The bigger thing is, and this is a North and South problem. It's a United States problem. Our nation was founded on enslavement. Our national wealth is derived from 250 years of enslavement, and that might have to be an out in the hall conversation to keep going with that. But reparations need to understand that nobody is clean. That's the last thing I would say in this, is that people have the treasury of virtue. You know, there's the North, because, quote, we won the war, has the idea of a treasury of virtue. I'm glad the United States won the war, but it doesn't absolve hundreds of years of other sins that were happened. So I would love to talk much more about this, but I think if there's other class coming in, we have to.
Mostly class coming in, nobody beat down the door, but,
Okay.
but we probably should wrap it up. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You come down to the Veterans Center. Usually wants
I
to
think
chat.
it was-